Okay, hello everybody. Um, Welcome to another webinar. Um, I'm Shlomo and I'm the CEO of China Business Webinars and eBusiness Chinese, and I'm happy to open an additional webinar. I see people coming again and again and to the webinars, and it's really great having a community around this, and it really feels wonderful. David Dayton is our guest speaker for today. And he'll be speaking about what you need to know before coming to do business in China. I reviewed the presentation right before, and it's really interesting, so I promise you it's going to be good. David Dayton is the owner and manager of Silk Road International. David has nearly 20 years experience working in and with Asia, and he leads SRI from their Shenzhen, China office. Before China, David was based in Bangkok, Thailand, and in Taiwan before that. David is a regular presenter for Global Sources new buyer training seminars in Shanghai and in Hong Kong, and has also spoken for Global Sources Supplier Education Program. David has been published in Eurobiz magazine and numerous other trade and online publications. He has also been interviewed by CBS Evening News, 60 Minutes, and BBC, Market Watch, and by National Public Radio on China-related issues. David has a master's degree in Southeast Asian cultural anthropology, focusing on comparative Chinese and Thai corporate cultures, and a BA in International Relations and East Asian History. David has worked as a consultant manager, trainer, and a translator on both sides of the Pacific, and he's fluent in both Thai and Mandarin. And I'm going to make now David here is system as the presenter. You'll see his screen and we'll start the presentation. So David, you're on.
All right, thanks so much. Let me set up the right screen so that you can see the presentation, and we'll be good to go. Shlomo, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Welcome to everyone, whether it's good evening to you or good morning. Nice to have you here. As was said at the very beginning there, I hope that you will participate by asking questions. We'll definitely watch for your questions and answer those as we go along, and I'll have a few questions for you, the audience, as well. So feel free to participate as much as you can, particularly if you've got some questions about your specific situation that may be helpful to others if we address during the presentation. Shlomo gave a good introduction for myself. I've had a few decades of experience in Asia now. Also, Silk Road has been in China specifically since 2002, and prior to that, we were in Thailand. That's where we initially started. But SRI focuses particularly on finding clients the appropriate factories and making sure that we have all the logistics worked out and we have all of the appropriate facilities and other services lined up and coordinated, QC, logistics, independent testing, and whatnot. And we do that for clients that basically don't have their own office or don't have a physical presence in Asia, can't be there on a regular basis. If you'd like more information about Silk Road or myself, what we do or how we may be able to help you, please look us up online. Also, you're welcome to email me directly and ask me any questions about your specific situation or about some difficulties or problems, or indeed even about what it's like living or working in China. I'd be glad to help. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move into some of the specifics on exactly what we'll be looking at today. We'll be looking at a number of topic areas in helping you prepare to move to China. First would be location. Where to move makes a big difference in China, as China is a large country, obviously, but the differences in the places and the areas of China are significant. Secondly, we'll be talking about some of the legal and business culture that makes things a little bit different, particularly contracts and negotiations, and how we in the West may see them versus how they are used and interpreted in China. Thirdly, we'll be talking about some shared experiences that may or may not be the same. While we are all working with folks that have MDAs or MBAs and a high level of education in China on a regular basis with suppliers or with bosses, with co-workers or whatnot in different Chinese businesses or with different Chinese factories, just because we both have an MBA or just because we both have international business experience does not mean that we have the same experiences. So we'll try to define a little bit about what's different about the similarities. Next, we'll be talking about some of the things that make China business specifically unique to China. And one of those things is that it's very, very personal. And so how you resolve concerns, whether it's with coworkers or employers or suppliers, there are some specific things that you need to understand to be very successful at that, or to not be a failure at managing personal relationships in a business context. Finally, we'll talk about some practical things that everybody can do to help make their business experience in China a little bit more enjoyable as well as successful. And a couple of examples of when things go wrong. So if you've got any questions, I'll have a list of resources at the end, and like I said, feel free to answer questions or ask questions to me throughout the presentation today. Lastly, now that we know what we are going to be discussing, we need to cover one slide very quickly about what we will not be discussing. This will not be a presentation about some of the more smaller cultural items, food, populations, Taiwan, shopping, taxis, how to give business cards back and forth, how to get on a train, how to go to a trade show, drinking games, putting your children in school. All of those things may be important and all of those things may be necessary at some point, but this isn't the presentation for that. If you are specifically looking for training on how to move to and adjust to life in China, or if you're going to be bringing a family to China, SRI has a different presentation for individuals that is focused specifically on family and moving and other logistical concerns that may not necessarily be specifically business related. So if you'd like some information about that, again, you're welcome to contact me later. All right, probably the number one question that I get asked when I fly back and forth to the United States and China on a regular basis is people on the plane or in the airport or family or friends or whomever ask me, so what's China really like? And over the years, I've just had a million different answers for people, and I finally realized that probably the correct answer, at least from my situation and from my perspective, is to ask them the question, well, which China are you talking about? And the reality is most people that have not ever been to China don't get that question. But if you've been there, you understand. The east coast of China is significantly more developed than anywhere else in China, the west coast or the western part of China or the interior of China. And what that means for business people is that not only is the infrastructure different, and the buildings, of course, are significantly newer and more modern, but that business resources are significantly more developed, that supply chains are significantly deeper. Living standards are obviously much higher. International experience, meaning the experience that the Chinese have had with international business or with foreigners, is significantly higher than it is. Language resources are more available to individuals. Education, trade shows, government and security, all of these types of things are significantly different on the East Coast cities. And when we're talking about East Coast, we're talking about the big cities that most people have heard of: Beijing, Tianjin, Qingdao, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, of course Hong Kong, and maybe even Fujian province in there. So those are the areas that are significantly different, and that will make a huge difference in choosing where to live and how successful your business can be. Not that there aren't options inland, but that there are physical differences that make the business experience different by going to the East Coast versus the interior of China. So the other part of China, really the other half of China, and really the majority of the people that are living in China are living in either in the central or the interior or western part of China. And while there are significant opportunities available in those areas, and there are some indeed large cities that are just as developed as some of the cities on the East Coast, there's still some significant physical differences. Part of the fact is that while there are some good cities, Chongqing, Chengdu, Xi'an being three primary examples of cities that have received massive amounts of investment from the federal government and do have quite a bit of foreign experience. Those cities literally are islands in the middle of agriculture and poverty and the rural parts of China. What that means for business is that you'll have a significantly more difficult time getting product out of those cities or even raw materials into those cities to do production. If you're moving there for some other type of business where you'll be an employee in the business, what it means is that there's going to be a limited amount of international experience in those locations. And while that's changing quickly, a lot of people are returning back closer to their homes from years of work in the East Coast cities. There is still a significant gap in experience, say even in Chongqing or Chengdu versus Shenzhen, Guangzhou, or Shanghai. The wages are lower, of course. The supply chains, though, are also significantly more shallow than they are on the East Coast. That means that you're going to have to add additional production times onto plans for production on the East Coast, not just transportation and logistical times. Because there's limited amounts of business resources, or there is limited amounts of business resources specifically because there's not as much business experience in these cities. And so while there's incredible opportunities to go and set up and start and work and take advantage of the low wages in the new areas and the government incentives to be there, there's definitely some costs involved with those advantages. Let me give you a quick example. I lived in Chongqing for just over a year, and while it was a huge city, larger than Shenzhen, where I live now, the development is at least 10 years behind. Shenzhen, of course, was the first special economic zone in China, and so it opened up to the West and to foreign direct investment from the outside in 1981. Chongqing has not had that opportunity and really did not get the full backing of the federal government in China and lots of investment dollars until the early aughts, until this decade. And so there's at least, even though there was some investment and some experience there in the 90s, there's at least 20 years difference in terms of infrastructure, in terms of professional experience, in terms of outside interaction with the West when you compare Chongqing and Shenzhen, even though Chongqing is a larger city and may, because of current government investment, have some newer facilities than even Shenzhen does. So in general, what you have to be aware of is that there's going to be a lack of middle management anywhere outside of the largest cities. Of course, there's a huge variety in the different types of suppliers and the different levels of quality that you'll be getting across the country, but in general, recognize that as you go further inland, it's going to be more and more difficult to get the types of experience and the level of quality or the level of professionalism that you're used to. Remember that while everything is possible in China, the further you move inland, even simple things can be more and more difficult. And that's true on the East Coast as well, particularly if you're going to be starting a brand new service or you're bringing a brand new enterprise into China that hasn't been done or people have not had experience with before. Again, something to remember is that while your buyers or your employers or your coworkers or your suppliers may have an iPhone and they may have a brand new car and they may have an MBA, they're 15 or 20 years behind you in terms of experience or in terms of cultural associations with those types of things. We've hired college graduates, for example, in our office that have never been in a private car until they were hired working for our company. Taxis, buses, of course, but never a personal automobile. So we'll get into more of the individual levels of that later. But remember that China is a developing country. It's developed incredibly fast over the last 20 years, but it is just that. It is still a developing country. Now, a couple of questions before we move on to some of the things about paper and about contracts and about working with individual Chinese. How many in the audience have been to, have already been to or are right now in China? It looks like a number of people have been. And how many people are specifically concerned about IP and development and protecting that IP when working in China? Again, this is a significant concern for a number of people, particularly folks that are moving and working into China. And so let's go there now and talk about some of those options and opportunities. Okay. If you've heard horror stories about working in China and the difficulties about getting people to follow contracts and confirm and sign and work with and agree to and actually follow through with agreements that they have signed, I'm here to tell you that probably all of the horror stories that you have and everything that you've ever heard, they're probably all true. And I'm sure that I could give you 100 more horror stories about those same types of situations and contracts not being followed and things not being done correctly. The reality is that for most of China, contracts are never the final word. They're simply a starting point for discussions and negotiations. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't sign contracts, and that doesn't mean that suppliers won't be legally liable for not following contracts, or that they don't understand that they shouldn't be following contracts. But the concept or the culture behind this idea is that business in China is simply done on a personal level first and a legal or contractual level second. And that's not being critical, and that's not a knock on Chinese business. It's simply a result of the fact that legal and even physical infrastructure in the past has limited what Chinese people were able to do in terms of enforcing or working with or dealing with contracts or even dealing with outsiders. Business is typically done on a personal basis, meaning you know the individuals that you work with, and so contracts are rarely, if ever, signed. POs are delivered back and forth, order quantities are confirmed and whatnot, just like in any business, but because relationships are based on a personal level, meaning you went to school with someone or you know someone from your hometown, signing a contract with someone that enforces and stipulates specific penalties would be an insult to others. And that's, excuse me, and also a reason why there's a lot of QC that isn't done. We'll talk about some of that later as well. What this means for you is that when they're signing a non-disclosure agreement or a non-compete agreement or a contract, they rarely interpret those things as being absolutely 100% legally binding in every way, shape, and form. And while they certainly understand the vocabulary in the contract and recognize that it's important to you, they don't really understand necessarily how important it can be in terms of lawsuits, in terms of legal protection for a buyer. And certainly, unless they've had experience with buyers that have taken them to court, they're not going to understand how significant it is and how important it is to you as an individual buyer and what it means to you to be, and what lengths you'll go to, to enforce those contracts. A second experience that I had. And this is as an employee and not as a buyer, which I have been for the last 10 years. But as an employee in China, when I first signed a contract to work for a company back in the 90s, I signed the contract and they came to me within days after signing the contract and gave me a complete outline and work schedule that was absolutely different from what I had signed on in the contract. There was significantly more hours expected of me every single week, 10 to 15 more hours in addition to the regular working hours that were expected to be included without pay, as well as additional other services and things that I was supposed to be able to do because I was foreign and a native English speaker at that time for the business. When I said no, I said we signed a contract, we had an agreement, and I'll be glad to do everything, and I'd certainly be able to help people out and, be a good coworker and offer favors and stuff. They didn't understand why I was saying no to the additional hours, and they couldn't understand why I would disagree to do something that they were asking me to do after we had agreed that they were going to be the employer and I was going to be the employee. And I said, well, we signed a contract and I agreed to do specific things for you, and I'd be glad to do a little bit more and help out, but you're, asking for 25 to 30% more hours on a weekly basis for the same amount of pay, as well as for, additional other activities and services. And they came back to me a few days later and said, we honestly don't know what to do. Nobody's ever said no before. We were just planning and expecting that you would do this because, well, everybody does it like this. And that was my first experience with the central Chinese concept of we're used to working with almost exclusively other Chinese, and we're not necessarily sure how to deal with or how to interact with Westerners who are a little bit more independent or who are going to focus specifically on what contractual agreements have been signed and already taken care of. So just a heads up there. And again, you're going to be seeing a lot of difference, a lot of variation, because in Eastern China you're going to have people who have significantly more experience. And again, There's a lot of variation, but be aware that the idea and the concept of contracts being something written in stone is not something that's completely understood or appreciated the same way that it is in the West. Further to that same point, IP is not understood the same way. If you are going to be working with somebody else, collaborating with someone in China on getting something done intellectually, some intellectual property, whether it is writing something up, whether it is having somebody translate something for you, whether it is getting artwork done and having a factory make a couple of alterations or changes to a piece of artwork for you, that IP is not understood to be yours. If there is participation by Chinese in developing your IP to any level, whether it's just translating something or whether it's making a couple of adjustments so it fits onto their machines because your artwork or your file format was different than what they needed, there is going to be a sense of ownership or entitlement into that process. So the more that they participate in developing, the more they understand that this is something that they have the right to use and to borrow and to resell or to alter and to use themselves. So you need to recognize again that IP, it's not just a black hole of theft in China, which some people have the idea that it is, but that there is a concept that there is shared property rights for things that people participate and work on together, even if it's things as simple as we're going to be translating this or we're going to be transferring this file type to a new file type. And so, you know, that much work or that little amount of effort that we've put into it still gives us the ability to participate or to use this and for our own means and our own ends later on. Finally, you need to get all of your legal issues taken care of before you come to China, whether it's contractual work with an employer, whether it's IP work, whether it's other legal patent issues or whatnot, or getting your business set up in China. You need to do the legal work at home and in China. And the legal basis, and I'm not a lawyer, but what I've been told and the experiences that we've had would support what we've been told, is that you need to have your contractual work done in Chinese, or that you at least need to have a Chinese contract that specifically stipulates that the default language is going to be something other than Chinese. But that has to be made initially in Chinese before any other contracts can be legally enforced in China. So again, you've got to have some participation with other people, contractual legal work, and you've got to get that done first before you start participating in China. Okay, now everybody has probably heard about guanxi, and everybody has probably heard about how to use personal relationships to further some of your business ends in China. And what I like to separate is two different levels or two different types of guanxi. The first one is personal relationships, and the second one is illegal relationships. Personal relationships are absolutely how things get done more smoothly in China, really anywhere in the world. Even in the U.S., we say it's not what you know, it's who you know. And that doesn't mean that you're doing under-the-table deals, but it does mean that you're making phone calls to individuals that are well-connected, that you have a personal relationship with. It does mean that you're going to be working with individuals over and over on a regular basis, and you need to establish a quality relationship based upon some of the cultural aspects and expectations of the Chinese that they have for you, not necessarily what you will understand a good relationship to be. And so you're going to have to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. But it does not mean that you're going to be allowing yourself to participate in under-the-table deals or backdoor deals or, you know, behind-the-back kinds of money deals where you're going to be giving cash or giving favors to individuals to get things done for you that you otherwise would not be able to get done. My experience in China is that you need to make sure that all of your everything that you do is legal, that is on the up and up, that is done morally correctly. If you are expecting someone to give a favor to you and you're willing to pay them cash or do something for them behind the scenes and they don't deliver, you're out. You're out the money, you're out the opportunity for legal recourse, you're out the opportunity to follow up with that person in any way that's illegal whatsoever. And so you have to keep that in mind, that when you're working for individuals that understand things a little bit differently, if you're going to participate in giving these kinds of deals, then or any kind of guanxi or any type of under-the-table deals, you're going to be leaving yourself on an island where you've got no recourse and no opportunities to follow up. Any questions about those types of things? Any questions about guanxi or legal relationships? If there are, please let me know. Type your questions in the chat, and we'll follow up on those if we can. A final point on this is that as you come into China and as you participate in these relationships and as you develop further guanxi with your employers or your employees or your suppliers or other folks that you'll be working with, you have a specific role to play in Chinese culture. And that role is defined very clearly for all of the Chinese individuals. They know who you are, they know what role you play, they know what's your purpose, they know exactly where you fit in their social hierarchy. You may never fully understand that role, but if you take the time to do that, if you take the time to understand your individual role, you will begin to understand guanxi and face more than you would otherwise. So I would encourage you to take the time to try to manage your face as well as others, meaning try to understand where you fit and where others fit and how your role and their roles interact. And ask and learn and be willing to listen to the people around you that have had experience that try to explain things to you about why this situation did or did not work. My experience with faces after living in Asia for 20 years and being married to a Chinese is that I probably will, despite all of the schooling and experience, never fully understand how important face is to Chinese individuals and how much it is involved in everyday business transactions. All right. Because of those personal levels of relationships and because of the importance of individual face in business transactions and in communicating with people, public confrontation is not understood or appreciated. What this means specifically if you're an employee is that there is no such thing as loyal opposition to the boss. What it means
David,
if you're
excuse me?
working with a factory is that you don't call people out on mistakes. Yes?
We've got a question from Lior, and he asks regarding the roles. So he asks, what's the role of lawyers in China then?
The role of lawyers in China. Well, if you look at lawyers in China right now, they're very specifically defined and limited. The government appoints specific lawyers for individuals. There's very limited interaction. When we're talking about criminal and very public cases, very limited interaction or opportunities that the defense lawyer has for individuals. Lawyers in business cases have significantly more leeway, but it's not the confrontational, legals type of thing that you see on TV that you might experienced in the West here. They are much more a function of filing paperwork, making sure the documents are in order. It's not two lawyers sparring over specific details and grilling people in a court situation. That's not the role of lawyers here because, again, the public confrontation isn't necessarily appreciated. And there's very limited opportunities for that types of legal access. And foreign lawyers also are not allowed to practice that type of law in China either. So the role of lawyers is limited more specifically to a lot of business law, which would include, copyright infringements and IP and contracts and all sorts of things of that nature, but not the significant, stand up in court, arguing back and forth types of law that I think that we all think of when we first talk about law outside of doing contractual work. Does that answer your question? Do you have a follow-up?
We have another remark from Bob, and he says that the legal systems has come up greatly since 1995. More and more cases are being judged in Western fashion, but still
Absolutely.
Chinese culture task command.
Absolutely, Bob. You're exactly right. Personally, I've had a number of court cases in China, and we've been successful in all of them. I know a number of other foreign businesses and foreign businessmen that have had multiple successes in Chinese court. The Chinese courts have improved dramatically, particularly in the last 5 years. China has recognized that it is in their best interest to make sure to keep foreign investment coming into China, that there is, as much as they can, as quickly as possible, a safe and efficient legal business environment in China. So certainly there are things that have happened in the last 10 and 15 years, but specifically in the last 5 years, that have made the legal system in China much, much better than it was 5 to 10 years ago. Having said that, though, just because you can get a decision in a Chinese court does not mean that there's any good level of enforcement. or that does not mean that there's any level of understanding about how to apply that in different cases. One of the things that's lacking significantly in China is precedent, simply because the legal system is brand new and there's so many new types of businesses and so many new types of court cases, and it's so large and there's so many things being applied so broadly all over the country. Bob, you're right on. Things have gotten a lot better. They continue to get better. I'm saying in general, though, you need to realize that it's not, you can't have the same expectations for Chinese courts here as you would in the West. Thanks for that comment. Anyone else?
Agreed. Thanks, Bob. Okay.
All right. Okay, let's talk about some of the things that are differently similar. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that when we have clients that come to China and they spend a few days and go around factories and stay in hotels and travel with us around to different facilities across the country, one of the things that they almost always mention every time is, wow, we can't believe how modern this is. Look at the subways. Everyone's got an iPhone. Look at all these incredible glass and steel skyscrapers. I can't believe how many people in your office have MBAs, or I can't believe how many people in these factories have been to another country already. And those things are absolutely true. There's a lot of things that are very similar on the surface in China to anywhere else. If you go to Shanghai or Beijing or Shenzhen, you're going to see buildings that look exactly the same as Hong Kong or London or New York or Los Angeles. And a lot of times they're going to be newer and they're going to be more updated. And maybe, you know, for your particular industry, even some of the machinery in China is more advanced than what you're seeing back home, depending on where you're coming from. But just because the physical trappings are the same does not mean that all of the other things are exactly the same. Probably the most impactful example for most people working in China is the idea that just that you have an MBA and they have an MBA, and that means you have a real basis of commonality that you can work and grow from. My experience with working with MBAs is that they are incredibly talented and that they are extremely bright, but they have had little to no work experience whatsoever. Anybody that's graduated from a Chinese university with an MBA has done so in the last 10 years. There aren't any MBAs that were granted prior to about I think it was 1994, 1995 in China. And so that means that you just don't have anybody with a lot of experience, work experience. Now, also, what that means is that those students or people, recent graduates, excuse me, that are graduating from Chinese colleges and universities are the one student probably in their family for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 generations that has ever gone to college. That means that they've only gone to school for the first 25 years of their life. They never had a part-time job. They've never gone out on an internship outside of their MBA, and they've never done anything at home in hobbies in terms of like let's learn how to tear apart and rebuild cars, or let's do ham radio, or anything like that. And what that means is that while you've got some people that are extremely bright, book learning is where they excel, but practical application of those types of things is very, very limited simply because they haven't had as much experience as a Western MBA outside of the classroom. Another thing that's limiting in business, while things may look the same, is the fact that Chinese companies are extremely vertical. What that means practically is that if you're working within an organization, or even if you're working with a supplier, there are going to be very, very few people who can actually make and keep commitments. That limits creativity, and that defines people in very strict roles, and that limits them to a very vertical hierarchy. That means that you've got 2 or 3 people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom. And again, like I mentioned before, there's no such thing as loyal opposition. Debate, self-promotion, doing things outside of the box typically are not appreciated in Chinese culture. And so again, you've got people that have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a lot of talent, but they aren't necessarily in an environment that allows them to grow or learn or use that. One of my close friends that I worked with in China for a number of years worked in the South China office of a large box store. And he and I would get together on a regular basis and talk about doing business in China. And my experience has been that his experiences, my experiences were just about the same except for the dollar amounts that we were talking about. But one of the stories that always stuck out with me was his frustration that he came and shared with me after working in his Shanghai office for a number of months with some of the best and the brightest, most recent MBA graduates from the top schools in China. He says that their company was, of course, able to hire some of the very top people, and that they were able to, pick through the marketplace for recent graduates and MBAs and get some of the best folks onto this group, onto this team that he was working with and leading. Excuse me. What he said was a frustration for him is that despite the fact that they were getting some of the very best people that they could in China, that there was a serious lack or willingness or unwillingness from people to be able to stick their heads up from the crowd, to be able to take personal responsibility for new ideas and to present new options and new opportunities. He said that he personally sat in a room with 15 to 20 of the best employees that they had, planning for a new team, asking for options and solutions and for volunteers, and timed pauses of over 10 minutes while people just sat there unwilling to make comments, unwilling to volunteer, unwilling to be different, to use the experience and the knowledge they had. Now, certainly you could say, well, maybe their culture or maybe their business environment didn't allow for this. And I would agree that maybe that could be indeed part of it. But what I'm also seeing across the board from different people in different industries is that, again, there's a lack of creativity. Maybe it's structural, maybe it's the individual companies, but there is, and I don't mean lack of creativity like they can't think of new ideas, I mean lack of applicability of creativity, meaning that they have ideas, but their environment, whether it's cultural or the specific business or the vertical hierarchy of the company, is limiting the opportunity and the willingness of individuals to present new things. And so thinking out of the box, again, is not something that it's going to be common or that you're going to see a lot of. So, who are the people that you're going to be working with in China? Well, there's three very different groups, and because China has changed so fast, the demographics of these three different groups are extremely, extremely different. The very youngest folks, the right out of college, the people with the MBAs and the people with the best degrees in China have basically been spoiled their whole lives. They've been taught that they are going to school and they are going to be taking care of themselves, their wives, their children, and probably 4 parents and maybe even other relatives that are still alive. So you've got to understand that they've got some great education. They've got absolutely no work experience. Their family probably has gone into significant debt to get them the education that they have, and so there's significant family pressures. They're used to the same types of things, though, that Western 20-somethings are used to. Electronics, iPads, iPhones, whatnot, cars. They expect to have a car if they don't have one very soon, and they're used to fast food, eating out, business culture, movies, and things like that. But another significant difference about this group is that they have never seen negative growth. Not only have they only seen positive growth, they've only seen absolutely explosive positive growth. And what that means is that they don't understand hard times. They don't understand sacrifice. Now, some of these kids may have come from poorer backgrounds, but typically when you're talking about college-educated kids in their 20s, you're not going to be seeing a lot of that. Where you are going to be getting into people with significant experience with poor backgrounds is the 30-somethings in China, the next generation, the next demographic group. These are people that typically had to work hard for everything that they've got. They're folks that were born in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, and while they've seen positive growth, chances are they're coming from somewhere outside of the East Coast, and so for the first 15 years of their life, they did experience significant amounts of poverty. So they have experienced the hard times. They probably had to work, or their family had, multiple members of their family had to work significantly harder than the other group, than the other demographic that we talked about already, to get them into and through college. They probably are the only member of their family, an extended family, with some college education, and they're probably the first person in their family with a significant amount of money. They are the ones that are buying and fueling the property bubble, and they're typically supporting other family members and buying cars. This would be the first group of people that are buying their first car in Chinese families. The last group, or the last demographic that you might be working with, are the 40 to 50-somethings. These are quite similar, I think, to what would be, folks that are in the 80s or 90s in the United States that lived through the Great Depression. The lives were very, very difficult living in the 60s and 70s and early 80s in China. They saved everything. They had little to no education. they are moving to, or in the cities now simply because they took advantage of an opportunity to start a business that was almost exclusively based on personal relationships and extremely hard work, and they've either built themselves up or their children have built themselves up and moved them into positions later on. So you can see that the demographics for these three groups are very significantly different. Their background experience is significantly different, and so their understanding of how to work with foreigners and how to do business, of course, is also significantly different. Let me give you an example here. We work with a factory up by Shanghai, and the factory owner originally was a school teacher, and he made $8 a month. He made $8 a month in the late 80s. So he was making less a month than I was making per hour working as a DJ in college. So there's an idea of some shared experiences, or an example of what you and we and I grew up with versus what your Chinese counterparts grew up with. Anyway, he opened his factory in the late 80s with a couple of his sons of his, and they've since moved, of course, out of teaching and into simply manufacturing. And he has been working in this factory with his sons for the last 20 plus years now. In those 20 plus years, he's been required to do a number of things by the state. Two things in particular struck me as being something that I couldn't even fathom doing myself. First of all, he and his sons built their first factory by hand by themselves. But secondly, the government came in and said, because you're a private industry and because roads are a public commodity, you're going to be required to build the stretch of road in front of your home and in front of your business. So he and his sons, by hand, with shovels, hand tools, built the roads in front of their factories. I'm not exactly sure how long each one of them was, but they built significant portions of the roads in front of their factories. These are the types of 40-somethings. These are the types of people and the demographics of folks that you'll be working with in China. So understand that while they may have some of the same physical outside trappings, they have significantly different background experiences that they bring to business, and so their perceptions and their understandings of the business relationship are also very different. Okay, before I move on to personal relationships, are there any other questions here? Can we take a pause and see if anyone else has got some comments? I'm not seeing
any comments?
questions. Slomo, do you have one?
I didn't get any of the questions.
Okay.
No, no questions.
Okay. We'll go on to personal. Because of a lack of infrastructure or lack of legal structure or lack of movement, maybe it's the hukou, the household registrations that have kept people in specific locations for a long period of time, or whatever other reasons, business in China is significantly more personal than it is in other places that have a much more impersonal, legalized infrastructure. What that means for you is that face-to-face meetings are not only helpful, but they're typically expected much more than they would be so anywhere else. How many of you, let me just ask for a show of hands, how many of you have already been to a trade show in Asia? For those of you, of course, that are already here, I would ask how many of you then after the shows have actually gone to visit suppliers or potential employers or other businesses in Asia after you've gone to that initial show? The importance of that is that while a lot of people think that coming to shows or coming to fairs or dropping in for a short-term basis is important because it lets them get some face time and it lets them see things physically for themselves with their own eyes, that still continues on afterwards. And that mentality of, I'd like to be there myself, I'd like to do things personally, I'd like to get involved and see and touch and communicate with the product and with the people as much as possible on my own, should continue on throughout the production process. So of course, if you're working there, it should, the idea and concept that you need to get involved with the individuals and participate in the social groups as much as possible in China will significantly enhance your ability to be successful in China. The reality is that group activities will improve performance in China simply because you will have more and more people that are willing to participate with you and recognize you as a member or a participant rather than an individual that is coming from the outside, inside their corporation or inside their organization or inside their group. Now, group presentations working together in teams sometimes can be very difficult. We've all been on a team or been involved in a group where one or two people didn't pull their own weight, or where a number of people did more than maybe other people thought that they should and were trying to hog the spotlight or whatever. And group dynamics are difficult to balance even when you understand the social nature and the infrastructure that you're working with. Even in your home country, group dynamics can be very difficult. And so when you're moving into China, you need to recognize that it's a culture that's significantly more group-oriented probably than anywhere else you'll be coming from. And you need to understand that those dynamics are important, and that those dynamics will affect how you're perceived by others and how effective you can be in teams and with groups working with others in China. One of the difficulties that we have had in working with in business, buying and supplying in China, is that the idea of cooperation comes up whenever there are difficulties. And we hear this on a regular basis. We'd like you to cooperate with us. We'd like to have a better level of cooperation. And unfortunately for me as a foreign buyer, oftentimes cooperation means that somebody else has made a mistake, and now it's the group's responsibility to take care of the individual problem. Because you typically don't point out individual problems and don't point out individuals as the problem, this can be very frustrating to buyers who are trying to maximize their costs and who are trying to work on a very tight balance sheet that's trying to limit out and define all of the costs and expenses of something and detail everything down to the last penny. So be aware that there's going to be some significant differences in how you understand cooperation and how you understand working together, and the things that are going to be acceptable and not acceptable. Of course, one of the things that is not acceptable is public confrontation. Even if you are right, public confrontation is looked down upon. One of the lessons that I've learned the hard way is that when we push too hard with suppliers in factories in China, they typically send a check out instead of up their game and try to participate more. If we lay down an ultimatum for a factory and say, you have got to get this right, or we'll be pulling the deposit, or we'll be backing out of the deal, or we won't be working any further, that is a sign to the factory that we are no longer a reliable partner. That because we have given up and are ready to lose money and move on, there really isn't any incentive for them to participate with us any further. So instead of being kind of a let's light a fire under these guys and get them moving and let's show them how serious we are, what it does is it says, you're not serious about this, you're trying to look for an excuse to get out of the relationship, why should we invest any more time and money in this? So be aware that confrontation, typically, particularly public confrontation, is not helpful. Okay. It probably goes without saying that most international businesses that move to China and most business individuals that come to China are going to have some difficulties that are non-business related as well, whether this is adjusting to the food or the temperature or the living conditions or whatever else it may be. You need to recognize that coming to do business in China, if you're sending an employee, if you're coming for the first time, if you're a new employee, or if you've got some coworkers that are new employees from foreign countries working in China, that there are going to be some significant difficulties for those individuals or for yourself coming to China that are not going to be business related. And I mentioned at the beginning that we weren't going to be talking about a lot of these non-business related issues, and I won't go into them in detail here, but recognize that non-business related issues are going to impact your ability to be effective doing business. And this doesn't just go for foreigners as well. Because Chinese have such because Chinese have a significantly more group-oriented concept of working together and in solving problems, there's going to be a lot of more group or social issues that are affecting the business environment. One example would be a manager that we hired a number of years ago. He was fantastic, and he worked with us for 2 or 3 years. We never had a single problem with him. We were thrilled. We were grooming him to move up the ladder in our company, and we were very excited about where things were going with him. Literally at the drop of a hat one day, things started to go sour. Things started to go bad. He started showing up late for work. He started having problems with other employees at work. He was missing appointments at factories that he was supposed to be to. And at first we thought, maybe he's sick. Maybe there's something wrong. We tried to talk to him. It didn't come out. We couldn't figure out what's going on. And finally, one day he came to us about a month into these problems and said, you know what, I've got to quit. And we were just shocked. It came out of the blue. We didn't know anything about it. And we asked him why, and he finally confessed and said, my parents are forcing me to marry somebody with connections from our hometown village, and to do so, I have to move. And I've been trying to postpone it and trying to delay and trying to get out and make changes and do things, but I can't say no to my parents, and so I have to quit and I have to move to a different city. Now, this is an extreme example, but this happened in Shenzhen in 2006. So it was 5 years ago in one of the largest and richest cities in China. This is somebody that had an MBA from a Chinese university and for all intents and purposes was well-dressed, well-educated, and everything that you'd expect from somebody with an MBA in Shenzhen. The point is that there are significant outside influences that can affect doing business in China. Now, the next point I get a lot of pushback from, particularly from Chinese individuals, and I don't mean this to be insulting in any way to anyone in China. What I do mean is that China is amoral. Amoral meaning that there isn't an absolute standard of right or wrong that you can appeal to. There isn't a legal standard of, hey, we don't do things like that, or there isn't a moral standard, say a Christian ethic that says, you know, there's a line, there's a limit where people are good just to be good for no other reason, not because there's a law. Now, oftentimes people get offended and say what I'm saying is that China is immoral, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's amoral, meaning there isn't a defined standard across the board that everybody can appeal to that's saying, you know, this is really the basis here. This is really the bottom of the barrel. We can't go below this. We can't not do this. And so you have to understand that because China doesn't have a lot of religion and hasn't until very excuse me, until really this last year brought Confucianism back to where they can say, hey, there's some moral standards that we need to have inside of business and inside of our culture. You're not going to be able to take the moral high ground and say, hey, you know, we have a responsibility to help me out here, or to do this, or to it's the right thing to do. You're not going to get anywhere asking for the right thing to do to be done. And I don't mean that to be critical in any way, but I do mean it to define that if, as we've seen many, many times with buyers who are just so frustrated and they say, how can you do this to me? You know, how can this happen? What I'm saying is that there isn't really the same concept here in China that there is in the West about what should or should not morally happen. One of the security offers for a large multinational company that I worked with and was friends with over the years in Shenzhen told me that he has some of the most incredible stories that you'd ever want to hear about doing business in China. One of the things, though, that has always stuck in my mind about things that he told me was that they were looking for, in their company, which has offices all over China, they were looking for a ring of what he called a ring of thieves, people that were marking product up and pushing QC standards down and taking a bit off the top on every single one of the transactions. They were looking for managers. They were looking for QC individuals. They were looking for individuals that had access, be powerful individuals, meaning people higher up in the hierarchy. And these were the types of people that they were looking at, and they couldn't find where this was happening, and they couldn't find where this money was going, and they couldn't find who was in charge of this. And one day something slipped, and they got a piece of paper. I don't remember exactly what it was, what the information was, but they got a little bit of information from somebody that pointed to one of the secretaries somewhere. And he said that after they got that tip, that they started looking into some of the everyday average secretaries in the office. And he said that the nicest, oldest ladies in the office, the one that were just managing the books and answering the telephones, were in charge of one of the largest kickback schemes that he had ever uncovered in 6 years of working in China. Now, again, I'm not trying to say don't trust your secretaries or anything like that. But what I am trying to say is that there is a level of understanding that if you have access to things, that you should be taking advantage of those, because you might not have access for very, very long. And that's simply a preservation skill that's been learned over years of political unrest and dramatic change in the economy over the years. So be aware that those are some of the types of things that are going on. Okay. we'll talk about communications in just a little bit. But the last point that I want to make is that while a lot of this may sound negative, or it may sound like that there's a lot of problems with China, what I want to emphasize too is that China is a wonderful place to do business and to live and to work. The Chinese people are fantastic hosts. They want you to love them and love their country and love their families. And if you're willing to learn some Chinese, it will go a long way to helping you make lasting, long-lasting friendships with Chinese people. And these people will want you to understand and love and enjoy their history and culture. They're rightfully proud of the things that China has done in the past. They're rightfully proud of the growth and the development that China has made in the last 10 or 15 years. And you need to recognize that while you probably have pride and love for your home country, they have that same feeling as well. And they certainly want to be able to share that love and have that pride. And I think that if you remember back to the Olympics and the torch ceremony and all of the problems that happened all over the world, the Chinese people were most frustrated, not that there was opposition to China, but that China's time to shine, China's opportunity to get a little bit of the spotlight was overwhelmed by people that were protesting the problems in China. Problems in China exist, and Chinese people are aware of the problems, and Chinese people know that there are difficulties. But if somebody does a good job, they're not going to rain publicly on that person's parade. And that was one of the biggest frustrations for the Chinese, is they thought, you know, hey, your country has problems too, but we're not raining on your Olympics. You don't see Chinese protesters at your Olympics. And they were personally offended, I think, at the fact that foreigners were willing to take this Olympic event and make it a political or public event. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying that this is something that you need to understand about China, is that those types of things will be taken personally. And attacks on China, or criticisms or comments about how difficult it is to work in China, or how you can't stand this or that about China, or I can't believe this happened to me in China, those things will be taken personally. And individual Chinese will feel embarrassment or uncomfortableness about general complaints about China from foreigners. So be very careful about that. And recognize, too, that that love of country can go beyond and can get a little bit out of control sometimes. Sometimes it's government-sponsored. They allow people to get a little bit out of control and do things. It's kind of like a controlled burn, where they let something explode and then rein it back in, just so that people can get some of the anger and vent out of their system. But again, recognize that those feelings are real and those feelings are legitimate. And these people and their love for their country and their friendship and their hospitality towards you is genuine and is legitimate as well. And there's some just wonderful, wonderful people and wonderful opportunities in China. I mentioned before I married a Chinese, and I've been totally welcomed and accepted into my Chinese family. I have some of the greatest family and friends that are Chinese, and they've been, very, very good to me. And I've got a lot of friends who have done the same. But I've also been told a number of times in working with China, get out of our country. During the Olympics in particular, there were 2 occasions when publicly I was threatened simply because I was a foreigner. So recognize that there are highs and there are lows and there are difficulties and there are opportunities. I think that those are probably the same in every country, but that the Chinese as individuals are wonderful, genuine, kind, incredible hosting individuals that have been thrust into a very dynamic, very radically and quickly changing culture and financial situation that is China business today, and it's quite hard to deal with all of that, really.
David, excuse me, we've got a question.
Sure.
We've got a question from Eric from a couple of minutes ago, which actually I didn't see, but now I see it. And he asked about confrontation that you talked about before. And he asked if confrontation, when a problem arises, is looked down upon, how do you motivate these people to correct it?
Okay, that's a really good question. One of the things that we've seen happen is in groups, because there's always a group meeting, and you have to discuss the problems. And that's the difference, is that you motivate people by in public discussing the problems, meaning how to fix and how to move forward and how to make changes in general ways. General meaning not addressing individuals, not general meaning let's just gloss over this problem and talk about it, in a big picture kind of way. You can talk about specific problems very specifically and outline tools and steps on what has to be done. And indeed, my experience working with Chinese is that's what needs to be done. You need to give specific steps and specific outlines, and they will do exactly as you ask them to do. I mean, that's, again, goes back to the lack of any type of experience outside of education. Give them specifics, and they will do those specifics. If there and when there is an individual that is the problem, that person needs to be taken aside and talked to individually. Confrontation publicly is absolutely unwelcome, but working with someone as an individual, hey, we're having this problem on a regular basis. I need you to do this. Let me tell you some of the mistakes, and let me show you what some of the opportunities are. Let me help you fix the problem so that you as an individual can be promoted and work and continue to be successful and whatnot here. Those types of behind-the-scenes mentoring and not criticism is typically how we have seen the Chinese best respond. Now, you can blow up at a problem. You can have, you can pitch a fit sometimes. And sometimes, if you've scripted it out and there's some behind-the-scenes work to compensate for the fact that you're going to have a public scene or make a public scene to show how important something really is, then something like that can be useful. But again, talk with your Chinese counterparts. Try to have them help you understand what will and won't work. Publicly deal with generalities, privately deal with individuals, and that's how you can work through confrontational situations. Any other questions on that or other questions?
Eric says thanks.
You bet. Thanks, Eric. Okay. The final section, let's talk about some practical skills that can help you out in getting to success and really being successful in business. First of all, regardless of if you're going to be working with a supplier or you're trying to find a job in China, you need to do as much due diligence as you possibly can on the companies that you will be working with or working for. One of the things that I would suggest is that while you spend some individual time meeting with people, that you don't waste a lot of time reinventing the wheel. There are tons of third-party, efficient and effective third-party services available in China for everything from factory audits to background checks on individuals and companies. And you can find out information about who your potential employer or potential partner is long before you ever have to spend any time or money working with them. And those are the things that you should be doing. If you don't speak Chinese, you need to find a trusted interpreter to interpret for you. Not a salesperson from the factory to translate to you what's going on. Not just a translator, somebody that you don't know. See if there's somebody that speaks Chinese that can tell you what is going on and not just what is being said. Because I promise what's going on is significantly more than what the words are that's being said. Make sure that in your interviews or that in your due diligence as you're working with people or even in following through on presentations and productions and employment, that you verify everything and that you talk to individuals that can actually make and keep decisions.
David Bob has a remark here.
Sure, go ahead.
He just says that regarding the interpreter, he should be actually make him a cultural translator.
Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Thanks, Bob. That's exactly right. You can have someone translate the words for you, but what you really need is someone to interpret the culture for you. Chinese is a high context language, and English is a low context language. What that means, if you don't already know, is that Chinese, you have to understand what's going around you for the words to make sense. In English, we're such a legalistic culture, and there's so many new and specific words in English, you can read the words and know what's going on without the cultural context. That's low context. But Chinese is exactly the opposite. And so, Bob, you're dead on. You have to have a cultural translator interpreting for you what is going on before you really understand exactly what's being said. Thanks much. That's a great point. Get everything written down, get everything signed. That's probably one of the best ways to make sure that your commitments will be kept and that the people that you're talking to can indeed follow through. And again, like I said, don't ever use illegal or special connections to get things done, simply because you won't have any opportunity to follow up on them whatsoever. Finally, communications. We've talked a lot about face-to-face and group communications and what's not, and I'd just like to emphasize the some of the practical points to make this more possible. Ask as many questions as you possibly can. Try to find out what is meant, not just what is said. Ask more questions than you think is necessary. Ask things to be repeated back to you to make sure that other people can clearly tell you what their understanding of what's been going on is, so that both of you are on the same page. Spend a little bit more time. Make sure that things are clear, short, bullet points, even if people have fantastic English skills. Obviously, don't be insulting or condescending. Don't dumb down your language. But be clear and precise as much as possible, so that so there never is a question, so that somebody doesn't have to lose face in public and say to you, you know what, I didn't understand. I know everybody else did, but I didn't. That rarely is ever going to happen. Nobody's going to stick their hand up in a meeting and say, my English isn't as good as everybody else's here. Will you say that again for me? And so you need to be aware of that those individuals exist in your groups, in your companies, with the people that you're working with, and speak to the lowest common denominator without being condescending, which is a real skill. Part of that skill is speccing out every possible detail that you can. There's no such thing as industry standard. Whether you're an employee or a buyer, what you're used to back home is not the same as what your Chinese company or Chinese partner is used to here, simply because they may be working with people, buyers, suppliers, clients from all over the world whose industry standards are completely different from what your industry standard is. So you need to spec everything out, and then you need to keep to your contract. If you expect your partners to stick to the contract, you have to do the same. If under duress, because of time or cost pressures, you're willing to change your contractual agreements, that gives license to your partners to do the same. They'll say, we have time and cost pressures too, and they'll be able to justify changes to the contract as well. Be prepared to renegotiate everything. It seems trite because everybody that comes to China says, oh, we always have to renegotiate our contracts, but the reality is that's the reality. You're going to be renegotiating. You're going to be going back over contracts over and over and over again. And so do that. Stick to the contracts. When there is a disagreement or a question that comes up, refer back to the contract. If you are consistently making the contractual agreement the standard solution for all disagreements and misunderstandings, pretty soon your supplier or your employer or whom your other partners are going to be going back to that as well, to be looking up the answer before they come to you, because they know where you're going. Finally, know the difference between price and cost. While you may have a good salary or you may have a good price from a factory, the cost of doing business in China is higher than either of those two things. Understand what your additional costs are to doing business here. Map those out, count those out, and see if it's worth it to you to be doing business. Oftentimes it is. Sometimes for a wife or for children, a spouse, a significant other, whatever, it may not be, and you have to count those costs beforehand. It may be that the price from the factory is good, but all of the logistics and quality control that's necessary to get it out of Chengdu all the way to the port in Hong Kong is not worth it, and it's cheaper just to do it in Shenzhen. There's a lot of things that you have to balance to understand the difference between cost and price. Okay, finally, one last thing. Some of the examples of when things didn't quite go right, and this is just to kind of end on a lighter note, and hopefully give you a little bit to laugh at as we finish up here and talking about doing business in China. Even individuals who are spending a ton of money, like for example the Hong Kong government on the street sign in the right-hand corner, make mistakes or don't make mistakes, but when they're translated back to native English speakers have a significantly different meaning or understanding than probably what was originally intended. So instead of a bountiful street or bountiful or bounteous blessings, you get the example at the top right, and I'll let you read that yourself. Winnie the Pooh, hold together Buddhist nun. I don't know where that came from. I'm still trying to figure that one out. And my favorite down at the bottom left is, please check in animals and alcoholics. This was at the desk of Ningbo Airlines at the airport in Ningbo. So if you've had too much to drink, I'm sorry, you won't be allowed in the cabin. You'll have to be checked underneath with the baggage. So even people spending a lot of money can make cultural problems, cultural mistakes, and have what is definitely not transparent quotation and clear consumption. So with that, I'll ask if you have any other questions, and then we'll talk about some additional resources for working in China, and then we'll finish up. Any other questions at this point?
Yeah, there is a question from Kenneth, and
Okay.
he asked something about the previous slide, and he says,
Sure.
I'm just going to read that. In regards to controlling public emotions, is it bad to give praise of employees in front of others?
No, it is not bad to give praise if it's sincere. What we have seen with some people in the past is that the desire to to have good public relations and the desire to be pleasing and this fear that, oh, I'm going to offend my Chinese counterparts leads to false emotions, negative or positive, or extremes, negative or positive. Absolutely share positive emotions in public with people if they are sincere. Any others?
Bob says, praise in public, criticize in private, same as Western. And Kenneth says, thanks.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think that you can be a little bit more critical in public in the West. I mean, just my personal experience. If I did something wrong and it was a group situation and we were talking about it, I mean, I think there's a little bit more leeway in the West pointing fingers, not necessarily hanging somebody out to dry publicly, but you know, publicly praise, privately criticize is a good rule of thumb wherever you are. You're right. Okay. Lastly, I think that Shlomo is going to be posting this presentation up on his website. I think that there'll be opportunities for you to copy down a number of these. These are books and resources that I would recommend to people that were coming to China, whether it was to do business or to live, you know, in whatever capacity. There are just a lot of good quality resources available on China. Now, there's a ton of books that are available on China that are not quality, but these are some of the ones that I've seen that that I've read over the past few years that I found are really good. And like I said, I think Shlomo's going to have some of this information available for you at a later time.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Also, there's quite a few really good blogs available right now on China. Everything from English teachers to anthropologists, to businesses, to law firms, to you know, private individuals writing about their experiences. There's just a ton of language and business and cultural blogs that are available. These are some of the ones that I enjoy. I would suggest that, of course, you look up Silk Road's blog. We've been named one of the top 10 business blogs a few years in a row now, and we're actually in a publication this last month that says we were one of the top 10 business blogs on China of the decade, of the last decade. So we're pleased and proud of that, and if you'd like some practical, experiential information on doing business as a small to medium-sized business in China, that's what our blog provides. China Law Blog's a great resource. Beijing Sounds is a really good resource if you're into Chinese, if you speak Chinese. There's just a lot of really interesting things. China Hope Live is a really interesting site that I like. It's just some individuals that are teaching that have some great experiences and some really good insight. Anyway, lots and lots of really good opportunities. And with that, the presentation's over. I thank you for your time, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. And if you've got any questions right now, we'll be glad to take as many as we have time to stick around for.
Bob says thanks, and he also recommends the book Wild Swans.
Yes,
some
very
people
good.
might have
Wild
read.
Swans. I wouldn't recommend June Chang's book on Mao that she wrote. I mean, even for me, who is not a China apologist, obviously, I thought her book was just over the top. Her book on Mao was just too negative, but her Wild Swans book is very, very good.
Bobby's asking about the job market in China right now.
For whom and where would be my follow-up questions.
Okay, Bob, can you elaborate on that? U.S. expats. Which industry? Anywhere.
Anywhere. There is There's still a big market for people that have
Oh, it says manufacturing. Sorry.
there's still a big market for people that have English and Chinese both and have actual practical business experience in China. But my experience is that Chinese, particularly in manufacturing, don't want to pay for the costs of hiring foreign individuals unless they're a very big manufacturer. There's a lot of opportunities to work as a go-between. There are a significant amount of clients and buyers that are moving from the West into China that don't have the resources necessary, or their factories don't have the resources necessary to either do project management or to do the CAD drawings or to update things, to adapt them to adapt them to each individual situation for manufacturing. So there are definitely opportunities there. I haven't looked into individual companies hiring like manufacturing engineers in China, but I know that factories typically are running pretty small margins, and typically, unless they're very large, don't want to spend the money to hire foreigners.
Okay, we've got some more comments from Harrison. He says that he's an internet recruitment company, and he can tell you unless you're in a niche market or industry and have lots of experience, it's beginning to dry up.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's what I saw in Bangkok 20 years ago. It was the same type of situation where that if you were in a niche market, then a foreigner was still valuable simply because there weren't any Thais that had those skills. But the general population, English skills, MBAs, engineering degrees, there's more than enough local talent at a much lower price.
Okay, and we got another recommendation from Hennig about Kissinger's book about China, and Andrew is asking about your outlook on U.S.-Chinese trade relations over the next few years.
First, I'm not a big fan of Kissinger. I read part of his book, but if you liked it, I'm glad for you. So there's two contrasting opinions. Secondly, U.S. trade, I don't know. I think that the politics in the U.S. are getting more and more negative, and they're really just looking for somebody to blame because there isn't a good solution out of the current economic malaise in the U.S. I mean, Americans just don't want to suck it up and stop spending, and they're looking for somebody to blame. I mean, that's a real negative opinion, but I don't see that getting a lot better anytime soon. I wouldn't be surprised if there were small fits back and forth where individual industries were penalized as we tried to feel out how disastrous a trade war would really be, and kind of play a little bit of chicken to see which country, China or the U.S., was going to go closest to the edge. I don't think it'll turn into an all-out trade war, but I think that individual industries will probably be hit for 6 months to a year at a time, like has been done in the past with electronics or tires or things like that.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay. Any other questions?
I see all the comments here, and I really can't read them all. It's really great that you're participating. I will also let David see that. So thank you so much, everybody, for that. That's it, I think. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you again at the next webinar. David, thank you.
Thank you.